We've just had the 30th anniversary. You've been at this work a very long time.
Yeah.
Does it feel different to you now? Describe this moment.
For me, the 30th anniversary is, I feel hope for the first time in a long time. We are in a moment in the history of the HIV epidemic that may be transformative, and that we have an opportunity between the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, between the Affordable Care Act, between the E-CHIP and the 12-City Project and all these different initiatives, plus treatment as prevention, to really change the course of this epidemic. But it took all of those things coming together at the same time to create this opportunity.
So the community has an unusual moment right now, and as we head into next year with the international conference coming to Washington and the election, what should we as a community be fighting for and looking to do, looking to defend?
As the HIV/AIDS community, I think there are several things that we need to fight for. First, there has to be enough money to implement the National HIV/AIDS Strategy, or else it's just another book on the shelf. And so we're going to need money there. Second thing is that treatment as prevention really is the opportunity to change the prevention game. And being able to roll out larger trials so that we can understand if this is going to work across large communities to actually lower a community's viral load could change the course of this epidemic. And finally, the Affordable Care Act. Making sure that the administration is able to fully implement the Affordable Care Act will change care for all of us.
Talk a little bit about, I think I experience a rift sometimes in the community where, we need more. There are people on ADAP waiting lists, there are changes in Medicaid eligibility, there's all kinds of stuff happening that's scary and people are worried. But there's also been some good news. How do we balance the good and the bad news
Sure.
and acknowledge what we've been given and also fight for the stuff that we still need?
So let me own this up front. I am very, very biased about this. I love this president. I think he has done extraordinary things, not just in HIV, but in many issues. And I think that he has taken on some of the toughest things and really followed through with his commitment. And so for me, the issue is, how do we get the word out about all the important things that he has done, that he has followed through on? Because in 2012, America has to make another decision. And this decision for the HIV/AIDS community could be tremendous, or it could be just a disaster. And as an executive director at a nonprofit organization, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but I am going to tell you to vote.
Let's talk about your organization, NMAC, and the fact that this is a disease that is disproportionately affecting minorities and people of color and people who are disenfranchised and have complete inequities in healthcare access and healthcare itself. Why is this happening? What do we need to do to stop it?
It's unfortunately, if you look at many diseases, there is a disproportionate impact on communities of color, particularly the African American community. And I think it is about social determinants. I think it is about access to health care. I think it is about access to social services. I think it is about employment. If you look at the unemployment rate in the African American community, I think it's 16%. I mean, that's outrageous. And if you look at who goes into our prisons, it's predominantly African American. And so all of these things create an environment that makes it almost impossible for communities to get out of the struggle. And I guess that's what makes treatment as prevention so interesting to me. Because this could be the structural change so that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, so that it doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. Because if we can reduce the viral load for the entire community, then if you have sex in that community, you're not guaranteed getting HIV, no matter how you have sex.
Right. Which of course is what's happening now. There are communities where there's just, the incidence rate and the prevalence rates are both so high.
If you live in Montana and are a soccer mom and choose to have sex with the AP guy, the reality is that there's probably so little virus in that community that it doesn't matter.
Right.
But if you are a young black gay man who lives in New York City and decides to have sex with another young black gay man, your chances of having sex with someone who's living with the virus is 50%.
Right.
I mean, that's unacceptable. That means that every other time you have sex, you're probably having sex with someone who's living with the virus. And unfortunately, until we can get everyone on treatment, that virus that you're having sex with is transferable. If we can lower the viral load, we can clearly show that we can stop the spread of this epidemic.
So do we need PrEP?
No, PrEP isn't the answer. You know, I have moral and ethical issues around PrEP. For me, it is morally wrong to give drugs to HIV negative people while you have HIV positive people on a waiting list. And for me, it is probably one of the most difficult things to understand why there's such a push around this. I also have questioned whether or not HIV negative people who aren't willing to use condoms are going to stay adherent to an HIV drug that they don't need to be taking and that may or may not have side effects for them. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's what makes treatment as prevention such an exciting initiative, because we're getting drug to HIV positive people and we're lowering their viral load, and hopefully that means that they'll have long-term better health, and that we will then also lower the viral load in the community.
There's a little bit of blowback, I get this too, on, when I talk about the impact and potential upside of treatment as prevention from the community itself, saying, oh, but do we want to push people onto pills? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And let me say, I think that blowback is completely legitimate, given the history of this epidemic around medications. In the early days of this epidemic, the medications had some awful, awful side effects. When you were going blind, they used to give you this drug called amphotericin. Well, we called it amphoterrible because the side effects of that drug were so hideous. And I think that there's still that memory, and there's still that fear about what are the long-term implications of putting HIV positive people on drug when they're asymptomatic. I think that, number one, we're going to need more studies, and that we clearly are going to have to look at that long-term implication. But I also think there's probably a long-term implication of not going on drug, and that's called death. Yeah. And so, that's the other side to that one too, which is that if you choose not to go on drug, you're going to die. And it really is kind of that simple.
Unless you're a long-term non-progressor.
Unless you're a long-term non-progressor, and God love those people. But they're the exception. They're not the rule.
Right.
And so for most people with HIV, at some point in their history, they're going to have to go on drug.
Right. And the way out. So let's say we look at the 052 data. We believe in treatment as prevention. We get the funding to do it. That still isn't going to end the epidemic. I mean, it might stop the spread of the disease eventually, but we need a cure, right?
Absolutely. I have to be really honest. I never used the C word until about 2 years ago. It was almost too much to hope for.
Right.
There was a part of me that at the core of my being wants a cure. I mean, because without a cure, all of my friends who are HIV positive are still going to get sick. And so the fact that we're openly talking about a cure now is extraordinary. And it is that moment that I think is in front of us. Now I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to be able to know if we're close or far away from a cure. But what I am going to know is whether or not we get funding for it, whether or not we make sure that that becomes part of the agenda for people living with HIV and for the AIDS community.
Stigma. Still ugly, huh?
Yeah.
What do we do? How do we get rid of it?
Well, the problem with stigma is there's first stigma around the disease, and then there's stigma around the people who get the disease. So you get this double whammy. You get stigma around LGBT people, you get stigma around drug users, you get stigma around sex workers, you get stigma around minorities, you get stigma around prisoners. And so we live in a society that sends all of these messages to many people living with HIV that they're not good enough, that they don't deserve to be. And I think that is absolutely a major factor in why people don't seek treatment or care. I think it is a major factor why people may or may not use condoms. And it is more than just getting rid of stigma. It's about empowering disenfranchised communities to understand that they have power and that they have a voice. You know, I am part of that generation of gay men who got to live my life totally out of the closet. There was never a moment in my life when I was in the closet. But I know that I am there because people in 1969 decided to stand up and riot at the Stonewall Inn. And I have a responsibility to those folks who stood up in '69 to live my life as a gay man as fully as I can. And that's the same thing I believe about people living with HIV, is their responsibility is to all the people who went before them. And that I'm not clear we're ever going to resolve stigma. What I hope we can resolve is people's belief about themselves.